My name is Emily. I am 29 years old, and I will never forget the sound of cheap tulle ripping in the quiet room of the church. I was standing there in my simple white dress, looking in the mirror, trying to convince myself I looked beautiful. Then Brenda, my soon-to-be mother-in-law, walked in. She did not say a word at first. She just walked up behind me, grabbed the edge of my $20 veil, and pulled hard. The fabric tore right off the comb, leaving me with a jagged piece of mesh hanging from my hair. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, a cold wave of pure humiliation washing over me. Why? Why would she do this minutes before I walked down the aisle?
She just smiled that icy smile of hers and whispered that cheap things do not belong in her family. I felt the tears burning my eyes, my hands shaking so bad I had to grab the edge of the vanity. But what she did not know in that moment of cruel triumph, and what I could never have guessed as I stood there crying, was that 4 years later, the bank would hand me a set of keys, and the door they opened would change everything. Before I tell you how a torn piece of cheap fabric led to the most unbelievable moment of my life, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? What state or city? I love knowing how far my story is traveling, so drop it in the comments below. Now, let me take you back to the very beginning, to how I even ended up in a room with a woman who hated me enough to destroy my wedding day.
I met Mark when I was 22 years old. He is now 31, but back then, he was just a charming guy who walked into the diner where I worked double shifts. I was exhausted, trying to pay my way through a community college business program without taking on massive student loans. I did not have much. I drove a rusty car, lived in a cramped apartment with 2 roommates, and bought clothes from thrift stores, but I was incredibly proud of my independence. Mark came from a completely different world. He grew up in a wealthy suburb, in a massive house paid for by his late father. He seemed fascinated by my drive. I thought he admired me, but I was blinded by the honeymoon phase. The real reality check happened when I met his mother, Brenda. She was a 58-year-old woman who lived her entire life treating people like they were either useful to her or completely invisible. Driving up to her massive suburban estate felt like approaching a fortress. The lawn was perfectly manicured, the driveway paved with expensive stone. When Brenda opened the door, she was dressed in designer clothes, her hair perfectly styled. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my scuffed shoes. She offered a tight, forced smile, but her eyes were entirely dead. She did not see a girl who loved her son. She saw an infestation. During that first dinner, the psychological warfare began. Brenda sat at the head of the table, asking me questions that felt like an interrogation. When I told her I was studying business while working as a waitress, she let out a mocking laugh. She took a sip of her wine and said waitressing was not a real career. She asked if I expected Mark to support me when we got married. I felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up my neck. I looked across the table at Mark, desperately hoping he would defend me, hoping he would tell his mother how hard I worked. But Mark just kept cutting his steak, staring at his plate, refusing to intervene. The very next day, I sat in my cramped kitchen crying to my best friend, Sarah. Sarah is exactly my age, 29 now, and she has always been fiercely protective of me. I told her about the dinner, about Brenda's cruel remarks, and about Mark's deafening silence. Sarah slammed her coffee mug on the table and looked at me with serious eyes. She told me that I was walking into a trap. She warned me that a man who allows his mother to disrespect his partner on the very first day will allow her to destroy their marriage eventually. I was young, foolish, and deeply in love. I defended Mark. I told Sarah that he was just intimidated by his mother and that he treated me like a queen when we were alone. I convinced myself I could win Brenda over. 2 years later, Mark proposed. He gave me a modest, simple ring, and I was absolutely thrilled. I did not care about the size of the diamond. I just wanted to build a life with him. But when we went to Brenda's house to share the good news, her reaction was like a bucket of ice water. She grabbed my hand, squinted at the small stone, and let out a heavy sigh. She told Mark that it was a very practical ring for a very practical girl, making the word practical sound like a disease. She then spent the next hour talking about her friends' daughters who were marrying doctors and receiving massive, flawless diamonds. The humiliation was a slow, agonizing burn. She wanted me to know that I was settling, and more importantly, that her son was settling for me. Planning the wedding was an absolute nightmare. We had to pay for everything ourselves because Brenda refused to contribute a single dollar unless she was given total control of the guest list and the venue. I refused to let her turn my wedding into a country club showcase where I would feel like the hired help. Because our budget was incredibly tight, I had to cut corners on almost everything. I found a beautiful, simple white dress at a secondhand boutique. It fit me perfectly, but bridal accessories were outrageously expensive. I could not afford a $200 veil from a salon, so I ordered a cheap one online for $20. It was just a simple piece of tulle glued to a plastic comb, but to me, it was absolutely perfect. The morning of the wedding was chaotic but filled with excitement. Sarah was by my side, doing my hair and makeup in the small changing room at the back of the church. I was incredibly nervous, my hands trembling as I held my small bouquet of grocery store flowers that we had arranged ourselves. About 20 minutes before the ceremony was supposed to begin, Sarah realized we had left the bridal emergency kit in her car. She told me not to move and rushed out the door. The room fell completely silent. I stood alone in front of the full-length mirror, taking a deep breath. I adjusted the cheap veil in my hair, making sure the tulle fell perfectly over my shoulders. For the first time in my entire life, I felt truly beautiful. Then the door clicked open. I smiled, thinking Sarah had returned quickly, but when I looked in the mirror, my stomach dropped. Brenda was standing behind me. She was wearing a pale silver dress that looked suspiciously close to white. Her face was set in a cold, hard glare. I turned around and nervously told her that she looked nice. She completely ignored the compliment. She walked slowly toward me, her eyes scanning my secondhand dress with blatant, unfiltered disgust. She muttered that this was what her son was settling for, a thrift store dress and plastic junk. Before my brain could even process her words or figure out what she was doing, she raised her hand and reached out toward my head. Her hand clamped down hard on the edge of my veil. I froze, completely paralyzed by confusion. With a sudden, vicious jerk, she pulled. The plastic comb snapped against my scalp, scraping my skin violently, and the cheap tulle ripped with a sickening loud sound. I stumbled forward, crying out in shock. The veil was completely destroyed, hanging in jagged, ruined shreds from my hair, the comb broken in 2 pieces. I spun around, my hands flying to my head, my heart racing so fast I thought I was going to pass out. I screamed at her, asking what she had done, my voice cracking with panic and absolute disbelief. Brenda just stood there, holding a torn piece of the fabric, looking entirely calm and deeply satisfied. She leaned in close to me and whispered that she was doing me a massive favor. She told me that cheap things did not belong in her family and that she would not allow me to walk down the aisle looking like white trash, embarrassing her in front of all her wealthy friends. She dropped the torn fabric on the floor, deliberately stepped on it with her expensive heel, and told me to fix my messy hair before walking out the door. I was left entirely alone in the room, staring at the shredded pieces of my veil on the floor. I collapsed into the chair, buried my face in my hands, and sobbed uncontrollably. It was not about the cheap veil. It was about the absolute degradation and the realization of her pure hatred for me. Sarah walked in a minute later and literally dropped the emergency kit on the floor when she saw me shaking and crying. She rushed over, falling to her knees, and asked what happened. When I choked out Brenda's name, Sarah's expression shifted from concern to pure, unadulterated rage. She was ready to storm out into the church and cause a massive scene, but I grabbed her arm and begged her to stop. I knew that if she caused a scene, it would ruin the entire day for Mark, and I still naively wanted to protect him. Sarah held back her tears, carefully removed the broken plastic comb from my hair, pinned my curls back up, and wiped away my ruined makeup. I walked down the aisle with no veil, my scalp burning, feeling completely hollow inside. During the reception, I finally pulled Mark aside into a quiet hallway. My hands were shaking as I told him exactly what his mother had done in that room. I expected him to be outraged. I expected my new husband to march over to his mother and demand an apology to protect me. Instead, his face flushed red, and he looked at the floor. He asked me if I was sure the veil did not just catch on a chair or a doorframe. I stared at him, feeling my heart shatter into a million pieces. I told him she pulled it off my head and called me trash. Mark rubbed his neck, looking incredibly annoyed. He told me his mother was under a lot of stress, that the veil was cheap anyway, and ordered me not to make a scene.
That was the exact moment my marriage died. It was barely 2 hours old, and it was already completely over. I realized Sarah had been right all along. He had chosen his mother, and he would always choose his mother. I plastered a fake, painful smile on my face for the rest of the reception, but inside, I was entirely numb. The first 2 years of our marriage were a waking nightmare. We lived in a small rental apartment, but Mark was practically living at his mother's massive house. Brenda manipulated him constantly, calling him over for every minor inconvenience, ensuring he spent his time and loyalty on her. Meanwhile, she continued her relentless campaign of subtle insults and emotional abuse against me at every family gathering. But the emotional abuse was not the only problem. Mark had incredibly expensive tastes, cultivated by a lifetime of Brenda handing him whatever he wanted. He started taking out secret credit cards to buy new cars, designer clothes, and expensive dinners we absolutely could not afford, desperately trying to keep up with his mother's wealthy lifestyle. I was working a demanding corporate job during the day and doing freelance bookkeeping late into the night, draining myself to keep us afloat. Every single time I confronted him about his reckless spending and the mounting mountain of debt, he would scream at me, telling me I was just a poor girl who did not understand how to live a good life. I realized that if I stayed married to Mark, I would drown with him. He was a sinking ship, heavily anchored to his mother's toxic expectations. The final breaking point came when I discovered he had secretly taken a massive loan against the small emergency savings account I had bled to build. He used my hard-earned money to buy Brenda a luxury cruise for her birthday. That was it. The veil tearing had broken my heart, but stealing my financial security broke my tolerance completely. I packed all my bags that very night. When Mark came home, I handed him the keys to the apartment and told him I was filing for divorce immediately. He cried, he begged, and then, true to form, he got angry and blamed me for never fitting in. I walked out the door and never looked back. The divorce was finalized a few months later, and Mark moved right back into Brenda's house, content to live under her wing again. I moved into a tiny, run-down studio apartment. I had absolutely nothing left but my laptop and a burning drive to never be made to feel small, poor, or helpless ever again. I threw every ounce of my pain into my freelance bookkeeping business. I worked 18-hour days. I took advanced courses, learned complex software, and started offering virtual CFO services for growing small businesses. For 3 solid years, my life was nothing but grinding work, silent tears, and strategic planning. Slowly but surely, everything started to change. I signed one major corporate client, then another. I hired an assistant, and soon I had an entire team working under me. By the time I turned 29, my agency was generating more income in a single month than I used to make in an entire year at the diner. I bought a reliable luxury car, moved into a beautiful high-rise condo, and built a rock-solid investment portfolio. But I never flaunted my wealth. I kept my head down, stayed focused, and remained incredibly quiet about my success. I did not need validation from anyone anymore. I knew my true worth, and I had the bank accounts to prove it.
It was around this time that Sarah called me with some absolutely unbelievable news. We were having coffee when she leaned in, her eyes wide with excitement. She told me that Brenda was completely broke and facing total bankruptcy. I asked how that was even possible. Sarah explained that Brenda's late husband had not left her nearly as much as she pretended. She had been maintaining that ridiculously rich lifestyle on secret credit lines and multiple dangerous mortgages for years. Mark moving back in and draining her remaining resources was the final nail in the coffin. The bank was foreclosing on her beloved suburban fortress. A very strange, powerful feeling washed over me. It was not exactly joy, but a profound sense of cosmic balance. The woman who had humiliated me in a church for being poor was now drowning in massive debt because she could not face the reality of not being rich. A week later, my phone rang with an unknown number. It was Mark. He begged me not to hang up. He told me he had heard about my business and how successful I was. He was crying, pleading for a $50,000 loan to stop the bank auction. He promised he would pay me back. I actually laughed out loud at the sheer audacity of this man. I spoke calmly into the phone. I reminded Mark that his mother had clearly stated that cheap things did not belong in their family. I told him that I was honoring her wishes by not cheapening myself to buy her love, and that I was certainly not stupid enough to pay for her financial ruin. I hung up the phone and permanently blocked his number. But that conversation planted a brilliant, dangerous seed in my mind. I immediately called my real estate agent and told him to look into the public auction for Brenda's property. The starting bid was incredibly low because the bank just wanted the toxic asset off their books immediately. I had the cash. I had the perfect plan. On the day of the public auction, I did not go to the courthouse in person. I did not want Brenda or Mark to spot me and cause a dramatic scene. I had my agent bid aggressively on my behalf. I sat in my luxurious downtown office, watching the agonizing minutes tick by. My phone suddenly buzzed on the desk. It was a text message from my agent. It simply read, "We got it. You are the new owner." I dropped my phone and covered my mouth as tears sprang to my eyes. They were not tears of sadness, but tears of absolute, undeniable victory. The universe had just handed me the ultimate closure on a silver platter. The legal process took a few excruciating weeks as the bank handled the eviction.
Finally, the glorious day came to finalize the paperwork and collect the keys. I walked into the bank branch wearing a perfectly tailored designer suit. The bank manager smiled warmly as he slid a heavy envelope across the polished desk. He congratulated me and handed me the keys. I picked up the cold metal keys, feeling their heavy weight in my palm. They were solid proof that my nightmare was permanently over. 4 years ago, I was a terrified, humiliated girl crying over a torn $20 bill. Today, I legally owned the very castle from which the wicked queen had cast her cruel judgments. I walked out to my car, started the engine, and drove straight toward that suburban cul-de-sac.
When I pulled up to the massive house, there was a large moving truck parked in the driveway. The grand front door was propped open. I walked up the long driveway, my heart pounding, but my steps fiercely confident. As I reached the porch, I saw them. Brenda and Mark were struggling to carry a heavy box out the front door. Brenda looked 10 years older, her arrogant sneer replaced by a look of exhausted defeat. They stopped dead in their tracks when they saw me. Brenda snapped at me, asking what I was doing there. I slowly reached into my purse, pulled out the set of keys the bank had just given me, and held them up high. I told her I came to make sure the previous tenants were out because my contractors were arriving tomorrow to tear up her ugly carpets. Brenda's face went pale as comprehension dawned on her. She whispered that it was impossible. I took a step closer and told her that hard work actually pays off. I reminded her that she spent her whole life judging people by their bank accounts, and now I owned her home, and she was being evicted by me. Mark dropped his side of the box, begging me not to gloat. Brenda suddenly lunged forward, screaming that I stole her home. I did not flinch. I stared her down with ice-cold eyes and told her that if she touched me, I would have her arrested for trespassing. I gave her exactly 1 hour to get her garbage out before I called the police. She burst into pathetic tears of absolute humiliation. I watched them drive away in defeat. I later sold the house for a massive profit.
Looking back, the day Brenda tore my veil, she thought she was breaking me, but she actually lit a fire inside me that became impossible to extinguish. She gave me the fuel to build an empire out of the ashes of my self-esteem. You cannot control how cruel people are, but you can control how you respond. You can let it destroy you, or you can use it to become undeniable. I chose to become undeniable. What about you? If you had the financial power to buy the home of the person who tormented you, would you do the same? Until the next story.